So as Jason said, I'm going to talk to you about nature-based solutions for riverine flood mitigation. Oops, now what do I do? How do I make it go to the next? Okay, but first I just want to talk to you a bit more about floods and why nature-based solutions to flood mitigation are so important. So from 2019 to 2024, there were at least $325 billion of losses worldwide from floods, and only 70 billion of those were insured. And so what that means is that governments and private individuals are up for a lot of money to address this. And that does not take account of many of the secondary impacts of floods, such as depression and illness and environmental destruction. Flood damages are growing exponentially, and this is largely due to climate change causing increased frequency of heavy precipitation, changes in land use upstream, such as removal of vegetation, increasing urbanisation and concentration of population and assets in flood-prone areas, and inadequate flood planning and management. Okay, how do I make it go down? Is that the best way? Down. Just the next slide. Left button. Left button. Just speak up. Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay, so in terms of the scale and cost of floods in Australia, floods from rivers that is, if we just look at one element of that, the Climate Council and Climate Valuation 2024 reports have analysed the data and have found that by 2030, 1 in 25 residential properties will be completely uninsurable due to the high risk of riverine floods. That's about over $400 billion worth of properties. I heard this morning that Elon Musk is worth about $400 billion, but we don't have too many Elon Musks to help us out here. So it's a really major issue that we're facing. What are we going to do with all those houses and all those people that live in all those houses, and who's going to pay? So it's a huge issue, and unless we can protect some of those houses, we're in for a major disaster. On the other hand, floods do have benefits. As Jason said earlier, they support wetlands, they support their related ecosystems and biodiversity, they regulate sediments, nutrients and water quality, they provide surface and groundwater, and they also have benefits in some areas in terms of tourism and cultural values. So imagine if we had a solution to flood mitigation that both reduced flood risk and also provided all of those benefits of floods and other benefits beside. And you can see here the difference between an area where there's no nature-based solutions and an area where there is. And put up your hand if you think that one's going to be better for floods. Right. So what are nature-based solutions? Nature-based solutions are solutions that are inspired and powered by nature, that address societal challenges, and in the case of our talk today, flooding, provide multiple services and benefits, including biodiversity gain particularly, and are effective and economically efficient. So nature-based solutions to floods both reduce flood risk and maintain and restore catchment ecology and the connections between rivers and floodplains. How do nature-based solutions work? So they work in three major ways. The first is that they can detain floodwater. They can detain floodwater in wetlands, in forests, and in structures called leaky weirs. They can reduce the energy and the extent of flooding through modifying agricultural practice, again through leaky weirs, through riverbank revegetation, and even through removing houses and structures. So the floodplain can flood without flooding the houses and structures. And they can divert floodwater through paleo channels and paleo valleys and other natural and nature-inspired diversion channels. There are many co-benefits of nature-based solutions. So as Jason said earlier, most of the nature-based solutions that address flooding also have a very big impact on improving water quality, which is something that we really are concerned with in many parts of Australia. If you plant a lot of trees, you'll get a lot more biodiversity if you do it properly. And so nature-based solutions can increase biodiversity. And they also have social benefits, health benefits and social benefits, which I won't go into the detail of. I know Tony will talk a bit more about this later. So the co-benefits of nature-based solutions, as opposed to those of, say, a levee wall, are actually a big selling point. Having said that, nature-based solutions are not mainstreamed at the moment. In contrast to the normal grey infrastructure, such as levees and dam walls, etc., the use of nature-based solutions has not been mainstreamed into the sets of solutions and options currently considered by governments, local authorities, or the private sector in different policy areas. Whereas decision makers are familiar with traditional engineering approaches, they are not familiar with nature-based solutions. And part of the reason is the uncertainty. We just don't know the extent to which they work or how much this will cost over time. So it's very hard to pay a lot of money for something and not know if it's going to work. It's also very difficult to estimate cost effectiveness. Part of this is because of the multifunctionality of nature-based solutions. So the benefits, the co-benefits that provide such extra selling points for nature-based solutions are the very thing that makes it difficult to estimate the cost effectiveness, because it's very difficult to put a monetary value on the benefits, such as improved mental health or food security, which means that the benefits of nature-based solutions are often undervalued. And even when the benefits of nature-based solutions can be shown to clearly outweigh the costs, these benefits are typically long-term and diffused across many societal groups. So it can be a challenge to coordinate raising the necessary finance, and so there are financial impediments. In terms of governance, nature-based solutions often cross jurisdictional boundaries and need the alignment of decision makers in a range of different sectors. Many of these people are much more familiar with traditional engineering approaches. And the land is often privately owned, and this means that there's much more diverse stakeholder and landholder involvement than there would be for an engineering approach. Then there are institutional issues. Nature-based solutions need the alignment of a variety of different policies and decision makers in a variety of different sectors: water, disaster, environment, land use planning, forestry, agriculture, and I could keep going. And finally, that diverse stakeholder involvement and land ownership compared to grey engineering approaches means that companies, local governments, national governments, non-governmental organisations, local financial institutions, and national and international financial institutions all need to be incentivised to implement nature-based solutions. So it's very complex to get all those stakeholders together and make something really positive happen in a catchment. So, oh, sorry, I meant to say something else. But anyway, so basically the enthusiasm for nature-based solutions is the evidence for nature-based solutions has not kept up with the enthusiasm that we see worldwide. And that's why we embarked upon this project. And we were very lucky to receive funding from the National Emergency Management Agency to look at producing guidelines for how you would use nature-based solutions for flood mitigation in Australia. And today's the first day that these have been publicly announced. And so we have produced 3 volumes. The first is book 1, Nature-Based Solutions for Flood Mitigation in Australia, which is a massive tome of everything you could possibly want to know about nature-based solutions for flood mitigation in a nearly 400-page book. So if you're really interested, you should read this book. It's taken us a huge amount of work to put together. The second is the book of catchment studies. So to do the nature-based solutions guidelines, we did a huge amount of research, international literature reviews, but we also worked with 6 catchments to look at how nature-based solutions in those catchments could address flooding. And those studies are provided in the second book, book 2. And then the third book is for those people that don't have much time to read, but need to do something about nature-based solutions or would like to in their catchment. And that's the practical guide, book 3. If you're interested in reading these books, just put your phone up on this QR code and you'll be able to access the books online as we speak. So I'll leave it there for a minute.
You can put it back up later.
I'll put it back up later.
Yeah.
Okay. So our approach to the nature-based solutions guidelines recognises that effective flood mitigation strategies using nature-based solutions need an interdisciplinary scientific understanding. It's extremely important. We've had scientists from ecology, from hydrology, from engineering, from Indigenous research, from social science, from economics, a whole range of different disciplines. And working together has enabled us to do this work. But not just working together, working closely with communities and councils and real-world implementation has made this work real. And finally, it's impossible to progress without having supportive policies, and there's a lot more work to be done in that area because nature-based solutions do cover so many different sectors. In terms of the guidelines themselves, they will provide to you the types of nature-based solutions. So in the practical guide, there's one page on each type of nature-based solutions, what it is, how it reduces flooding, what are the key design considerations, and where might these measures work best. And then there are examples from Australia and the rest of the world as to the extent to which those types of nature-based solutions have mitigated flooding. And in the full 400-page version, there's a lot more detail than there is in that guide. So the way that we've worked the nature-based solutions guidelines is that we've come up with an assessment framework, which we've worked out through the transdisciplinary research in the 6 catchments. And so first of all, we've got scoping and planning, and then we've come up with a range of potential nature-based solutions through consultation and engagement and research. And then we've assessed the extent to which those designs are going to actually mitigate floods. And then once we think they do, we do an environmental assessment, a social, cultural and institutional assessment, and an economic assessment. And you'll be hearing shortly from Kirsty, Wissing and Tony Webster on the cultural and social and on the economic assessments. And so, sorry, I'm being given the closing lines. Just to show the extent to which we have demonstrated that nature-based solutions can reduce flood risk, here's one small example of Pomona, a place which you can see gets very badly flooded. And what happens when you put in some leaky weir nature-based solutions, you can really reduce the flooding. Similarly, here's another example of a real flood event modelled in Moree, and what happens when you expand a paleo channel to reduce the flooding. The most exciting option is the Bremer catchment, where we have a spongy catchment which collectively enhances flood resilience. So we combine a whole lot of different nature-based solutions to impact on flooding. We have afforestation, leaky weirs, wetlands, revegetation of riverbanks, and urban nature-based solutions. And as a result, we get reduction in flood depths in a really big flood of nearly 80% in the key urban areas in Ipswich that we're worried about. And we also get improvements in water quality, river health, biodiversity, and carbon sequestration. And our economic analysis has shown that the water quality benefits alone, the incentives provided through improving water quality, can subsidise flood mitigation benefits. So finally, we've shown that nature-based solutions can mitigate floods. Our ANU guidelines bridge the gap between enthusiasm and evidence. Stakeholder involvement is essential for success. Careful planning and design is necessary at a catchment scale. We need to really, in our next project, which is funded by Natural Hazards Research Australia, start to build awareness and education, build capacity and professional practice, and look at the supportive policies that are needed to make sure that we maximise the use of nature-based solutions, both to mitigate flooding and to provide other benefits to our catchments and our society. Thank you.
So good morning all, and thanks very much for giving up your time and intellectual energy to sort of talk about this really important issue as well. As mentioned, I'll be talking about the social and cultural sort of considerations. I'm an anthropologist by training, and I'd also like to echo what Lachlan sort of opened and Jason also mentioned, acknowledging the Ngunnawal and also Ngambri peoples where we're meeting here today in Canberra, and to also recognise all the First Nations peoples that might be in the audience here or online, and all the First Nations peoples in areas that we're considering this work and disasters occurring across Australia as well. I'm a person of English settler and German migrant descent, so I sort of recognise that there's differences in the way that I engage with environments compared to how First Nations peoples do. They've got these really strong relationships and reciprocal responsibilities as well. So acknowledging that disasters, relationships to countries, and managing the way that water is cared for differs from different cultural perspectives. Personally, like a lot of you, I have experienced floods. So I was living in Meanjin or Brisbane in 2022 and it flooded. That's the street that I was on. I've also been experiencing floods overseas when I lived in Ghana. And these sort of play out in very different ways. One was regional, one was sort of in a city urban area. In my experience in Brisbane, we were really lucky. We had quick responses. We had sort of really coordinated things. And this isn't always the case across Australia as well. So acknowledging that our response to floods differs in different areas as well. Professionally, I've also worked with communities that have experienced flooding, and I want to sort of echo again what Jason said. The disaster might be a matter of days, weeks, maybe months, but the sort of long-term effects and this sort of delayed experience of still living with disasters can go on for years as well. I've worked up in the Northern Territory on a project around water values, and during that time, communities of Kakarinji, Dagaragu and Nitupuru or Pigeonhole were severely flooded and people had to be evacuated from there. And more recently, I've been working in the Northern Rivers area on the Richmond catchment. So places like Lismore, Ballina, other areas as well, and recognising that they're still experiencing sort of the effects of those floods in 2022. And my point here, and echoing that floods aren't always necessarily a disaster, but when they are, they're not just natural disasters as well. They're both natural and social. So as Canizaro and Co explain, disasters are both the interaction between a destructive agent, it could be a flood, a typhoon, other things, as well as the sociocultural and environmental context in which it impacts. And we really need to be thinking about this. What are the social implications of this? How are our societies set up with social inequalities? What does this mean in times of disasters and who's more affected from it? There was conversation earlier in our presentations around the bushfires, and Byami Williams is a scholar who's down in Monash these days, but also worked at the ANU doing his PhD. And he wrote about the Black Summer bushfires and how they were felt differently for Indigenous peoples, partly because of their relationships to country, but also partly because of the emergency services and responses. He explains that existing unequal power dynamics can make worse Indigenous people's experiences of natural disasters. These social inequities we need to think about. We need to address both in practice as well as in policies to avoid what he says is a disaster within a disaster. So again, disasters impact everybody, but how they're experienced can differ, and we need to be really sensitive to the sort of power dynamics and social structures in which disasters occur. And this is why it's really important to be engaging both Indigenous communities as well as other communities in appropriate, inclusive and meaningful partnership, consultation, engagement to think about how we work with floods and other forms of disasters. So Roslyn's kindly explained sort of how the nature-based solutions guidelines work in those 3 books. And I'll talk a little bit more about book 1 and chapter 5, which talks about consultation and engagement. This was authored with Jason, who you've heard from, Nicole Falconer and Sarah Davies, and it draws on a lot of knowledge and a lot of sort of published works by people, including Indigenous scholars in this space as well. Consultation and engagement need to be integrated throughout the project, not just a start or a set and forget activity. They need to be bottom up. They've got to be tailored to each social and institutional context. They should be recognising First Nations people's unique relationships to environments and their knowledges about how to care for that. That's been for a very long time. And publics aren't singular. They're plural. There's a huge diversity within it, which gets back to considering that socio-natural element and who's winning and losing or experiencing situations of disasters worse than others. So in terms of engaging communities more broadly, you can see on the left-hand side this image that Roslyn also put up in hers. And you can see that consultation and engagement happens throughout the process. And this is really important to emphasise. But you need to think of who you're engaging with. You've got to understand the social context in each situation. You've got to customize how to engage, what sort of tools, processes that works in each specific region. Think about what sort of risks, barriers, and traps might exist. Are there resource constraints? Are there particular knowledges or perceptions already existing that you need to work with and talk with? What are the regulatory barriers? What's the context that you're working in? And based on that, how is the best form of engagement going to be in the particular place that you're working at that time? As I mentioned, this needs to be throughout the process, not just sort of a one-time event. Roslyn talked about the Bremer catchment, and she and other ANU colleagues did work in this space, looking at both social and institutional considerations. They noted that, yes, you need this evidence-based decision-making, but it's also got to acknowledge how human factors can either support or hinder it as well. Without sort of social buy-in, it's not going to work. You've got to engage communities. What's the mechanisms? What are the partners? What are the barriers again? Is there regular consistency, transparency, cross-departmental integration? And where can you improve? In this case, in the Bremer, institutional processes, enhancing community, more consistent regulatory frameworks. At the end of that chapter are some resources about how to engage in nature-based community engagement. And then as I've mentioned, we really need to respect and appreciate and understand the perspectives of First Nations Australians and their role in this. To do this, we need to understand past legacies, including the sort of colonial history of Australia. There's been a lot of extraction, exploitation, degradation of country as well. There's also sometimes mistrust in government and other institutions in this space. You need to appreciate that there's these kind of traumas and contexts that you're working within and be sensitive to this. You also need to recognise that there's legal rights and lawfully defined relationships to country, whether these be at national, state or territory, or sort of other areas. And Terry Jenke and co in a chapter in the 2021 State of the Environment talked about this as well. And you have to build strong relationships, understanding protocols in the area, free, prior and informed consent, Indigenous data sovereignty and ICIP as well. And you need to recognise that each context is different as well. As a part of this, what counts as sort of benefits or co-benefits might change as well. So David Kirby's a proud member man from, and he's also the 2021 New South Wales Legend of the Water. And he talks about how it differs potentially from Western ideas of water management, which might consider economic, social and environmental in that order, to how his people understand it. He said, from an Indigenous perspective, water for the environment needs to come first. If we don't protect our catchments, economic outcomes will eventually fail and social outcomes too. And in a lot of the literature, there's these healthy country, healthy people ideas, and vice versa. Unhealthy country is harmful to people as well. So putting the environment first is really important to do all that other social, economic and other work. And perhaps nature-based solutions are a way to be able to build that in. Again, in this book chapter, there's a whole bunch of resources, including from scholars like Ollie Costello, by Amy Williamson, and a whole lot of ways to think about how to engage with Indigenous communities and partner with them. The State of the Environment also talks about the importance of Indigenous peoples in its extreme events and Indigenous space. And we've also got in the water space scholars like Virginia Marshall, Kate Harridan, Anne Polina, Malcolm Connolly, and also sort of Brad Moggridge doing really strong stuff in this space. So have a look at the sort of work that they're doing to understand how water works for Aboriginal people in different areas and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So this is my final slide, and this is the take-home message that I want you to get. We need to think about how we do flood management differently, but we have to do it together and we have to weave in all those different expertise, knowledges, including on-the-ground experiences. The image on the left is from a CSIRO publication called Our Knowledge, Our Way in Caring for Country. And it looks about sort of Indigenous practices and how they work with other forms of land management, water management and other areas. And they come together, not necessarily sort of always hybridizing, but really informing how you deal with problems and deal with solutions as well. We need to see floods as socio-natural disasters. They're natural, but they're also exacerbated by social power dynamics. We need to do flood planning with people, not just for people, not policy down. We need to identify and appropriately engage with communities, including Indigenous communities, in any flood planning. The conversation needs to be ongoing. It's not a set and forget activity, and it needs to be bottom up. Each community and socio-environment context will be different, and it needs to be tailored to that as well. So with that, I say thank you, and I look forward to discussion later in the panel.
Does that make up some time? No? Let's try and scoot through some of the economics as quick as we can, so we don't bore people. What I want to do is focus on just some of the complexities that are borne out when we're thinking about nature-based solutions and their application and the economic assessment of them. Yep. Okay, so three things: the role of economic assessment, complexities, what to do about it, and the political economy of preventing flooding disasters. So the first thing is roles and responsibilities. It is not the role of economists to determine what the right path is. Okay. The role of the economics assessment is to inform decision makers about the estimated values of all the important costs and benefits. The responsibilities here is that it's really costly to estimate benefits and costs, and more so in the environmental space. To measure everything perfectly is futile. So what we need to do is we need to focus on measuring the components that matter the most to the decision. The other thing is that a lot of these assessments are contested in nature. So consequently, you need to pay very close attention to the transparency and the rigor in the analysis. From the decision maker's point of view, they need to form a view about the relative usefulness of the economic assessment. Okay, the economics assessment is not designed for them to abdicate to their decision-making role. They need to bring together a whole heap of political, social, and economic issues in order to make an on-balance decision. And the courts typically, when decision-making is in dispute, typically look to make sure that the decision maker has taken adequate account of all the relevant information. When we think about assessing grey infrastructure, there's a whole heap of things we need to take account of. Typically, they're around cost avoidance of flooding, in this case, both direct and indirect costs. Then we'll have to think about intangibles, particularly the humanitarian and the disruption impacts of the disaster. We've got exactly the same sorts of issues when it comes to thinking about the evaluation of nature-based solutions. But in addition, we've got a whole heap of co-benefits that come from nature-based solutions, and a whole heap of biophysical changes that happen when you implement these environmental improvements. And that increases the complexity enormously. But thinking about the grey infrastructure, these are disbenefits. And largely we tend to ignore, or they've tended to be ignored in the past. Just something that needs to be taken account of. The general approach is that we take a biophysical indicator. Flooding, inundation is the main one, but it's not the only one. There's a whole heap of them. We apply a standard cost or benefit function, and that gives you an economic effect. Here's one example. In the case of housing, you need to define a whole heap of different housing types, develop cost structures, cost functions for them, and then you can start adding up the different costs. But of course, this is a spatial problem as well. So you then need to define the geographic distribution of those types of properties. The complexities start to ramp up really quickly. The other issue is that flooding is a very varied type event. Okay, so there's a whole range of floods from minor, frequent 1 to 5 year floods up to 1 in 100 year floods, and they all have different impacts. And there are literally hundreds of data points here, thousands of data points. So the role of the economic analysis is essentially to look at a whole heap of scenarios and estimate what the benefits are that come from those, estimate what the costs are, and then work out what the net benefit to society is from each of those scenarios to work out which option is the most likely to get us where we want to, bearing in mind the net payoff and the investment required. If we think about one of those scenarios, though, the benefits, the costs, and the net present value, which typically is quite small, these are not point estimates. Okay, these are ranges. Okay, typically when we say the number is, in this case, $4 billion, it's not. Okay, it's actually quite a wide range, particularly on the benefit side. On the cost side, we can probably get it a bit tighter, but there's a probability distribution around these estimates. So we need to make sure that we don't state these estimates with certainty. Now, the problem with that is that all the variation ends up in the net present value at the end. And it can have quite a large probability distribution around it. And sometimes you can't even be sure that it's not going to be negative. So it's problematic. Oops. Oh, and what I should have mentioned is that when you add the environment in, particularly climate scenarios, what you do is you cause those probability distributions to spread. So it makes the job even harder. Okay, so summary of the complexities. We've got all the regular problems you have with cost benefit analysis, discount rates, valuation methods, dealing with intangibles, dealing with risk. You've got some additional complexities when you think about assessment of nature-based solutions for flooding. You've got the climate scenarios increases substantially the informational and computational demands exponentially. You've got very significant intangible benefits relating to the environmental outcomes. All of the direct costs, human costs, all have reliance on biophysical indicators, so particularly flood inundation, but water quality, etc. And there's the temporal problems are more complicated as well. This last one says the search for a perfect answer is wasteful and futile. Okay, so what to do about it? The first thing is you need a multidisciplinary approach. It's incredibly rewarding to work in multidisciplinary teams, and it fosters a whole heap of innovation. The hydrology and the biophysical modelling underpins all the economics, so you have to work closely together. Innovation's no accident. Once you start doing this work on a multidisciplinary basis, you come up with unique solutions, like in the Bremer catchment, where we found that downstream costs by both dredging in the port of Brisbane and water treatment, the benefits to those two industries outweigh a huge investment in nature-based solutions upstream. And you need a structured approach. And thank goodness ANU has written a book on how to do that structured approach, which I'm not going to go into too much detail here. Two things. One is we point out that you should describe co-benefits. You can measure them to give people an indication of the size, but don't try adding it all together. It doesn't make any sense. And the other key point here is that it's really important that everyone knows what assumptions you've got in your methods, your models, your data and assumptions. Don't hide them. They have to be right out in front, and particularly for the decision maker. Just one last thing before we go into the panel discussion as a provocation. These solutions, sorry, the outcomes that we face with respect to disasters is no accident. They're a result of policy choices that we've made in the past. The other thing here is that we spend almost all of our money on recovery, hardly any on prevention. And there's a whole heap of political impediments to flood prevention. Sorry, last one. Can I just say that we remain encumbered with this 19th century colonial frontier conquering development obsessed mindset. We're compelled to tame nature. And we've turned our agricultural landscapes into drains. We'll get the water off the land as quick as possible into the rivers, and that exacerbates all the flooding. Nature-based solutions is one way to turn that back so that floods become more natural. Okay, hopefully that set that up okay for you guys.
So we now have an opportunity to ask the panel some questions, and I hope that what we got from the three speakers is a snapshot of the complexity that we've been dealing with in trying to develop national guidelines for nature-based solutions. Ros gave us an overview, the work. Kirsty emphasised the importance of community engagement done well and done continuously throughout the designing and planning processes. And Tony gave us a snapshot of the economic complexities. How do we assess complex cost-benefit situations? So I think we've got questions online as well. Evelina, do we have a big bunch of them? Right, would you like to pick out a couple and we can read them out? Perhaps I'll start off by asking Kirsty, can you just give a brief example of where you think community engagement particularly with Indigenous people has led to better outcomes post-recovery or in disaster prevention?
Thanks, Jason. And again, acknowledging this work is other people's work as well. So sort of highlighting it and encouraging you to read up a bit more. So I have been working around the Richmond catchment. Those 2022 floods were very well known across Australia. And the recovery was also really impressive. It was sort of being spearheaded, particularly at the beginning, by the Koori Mail. And there was this kind of effort of caring for Indigenous communities, but also all communities through this, and this really sort of practical, tailored approach. And it changed as people needed different things. Since then, I think there's been these conversations about how do we sort of bring in Indigenous perspectives. There's an organisation called Jagun Alliance. They're a Caring for Country Bundjalung organisation up there. And they're kind of going, well, how do we look after rivers generally? How do we sort of engage in floods? Again, recognising they can be really healthy and nourishing, but they can also be really harmful depending on how they're engaged with. And sort of really emphasising this care for all community, but also care for country in the process. So I think it's still very much ongoing, but that's an example of Indigenous people spearheading that response for people, but also kind of really generating these conversations of how do we work with country, including riverine country, from sort of this care perspective as well.
Thank you. So Evelina.
So I'm going to try and combine a few questions the online audience. One is about the costs of responding to disasters, and I guess the costs, I know that you mentioned that they're very difficult to calculate. There are some questions, I guess, around how we ensure that decision makers are considering things like unpaid labour from volunteers in responding to disasters, which may or may not be counted. So maybe some comments on that. And also about how the cost of floods continues for many years from a social perspective. So how that's accounted for when decision makers are thinking about not just economic, but also.
I think that's definitely one for Tony. Cost of recovery, cost of unpaid labour, perhaps the ongoing trauma of disasters.
I think the short answer is that it's not really measured much at all. It tends to get missed. It's very difficult to measure all the intangibles. In a way, it's a bit futile. The costs are huge, regardless. So trying to measure everything doesn't really help. What matters here is that, notwithstanding the enormity of the costs, don't do much about it. It's really quite bizarre. It's like as soon as it's done, we forget all about it. We go back on with our lives, and then 2 years later, we have the next 100-year flood. And it's, oh, it's happened again. It's unprecedented. Well, no, it's not. This is natural. It's going to happen time and time again. And the climate science tells us that it might happen with increasing frequency. So let's not focus on the little itsy bitsy parts of it. Let's think about the policy response to it, because really there is not much.
Thanks. Questions from the audience? I think we have a roving mic, so hands up. Oh, we've got quite a few. Perhaps we'll start at the front and work our way up. But part of the reason for focusing on policies for prevention, in Australia we have a really good example, a good example of policy response, and that's after Cyclone Tracy, our building standards in Northern Australia, so 75, were increased to make all new buildings cyclone resistant, and in fact they've proven to be very effective. So it's an example of saying, let's learn from the experience. We didn't have to cost it exactly. It added slightly to the cost of all new buildings, but it saved a lot over time. So a lot of good policy is based on principles, not on precision. So, Madam.
Does Chris Carolyn ever consult science research, and I guess the same for state government, environment ministers, or a local council, which really the most important to me for you to be talking to? I'm just thinking about the political aspect to it, and given that the government doesn't seem to be taking this seriously. And I can tell the other universities doing research and collaboration, we also probably and CSIRO, other institutions for actual knowledge.
Thanks. It's a really good question. It's a much broader question than floods or droughts. Perhaps I'll have a go at answering it, and Ros will have a go too. With our flood work, I'm required to repeat the question for the online audience. Essentially, do politicians, state, local and national, consult with the ANU and with other universities in trying to solve these problems? I think the short answer is broadly yes, because Australia still has a commitment to openness, transparency, public debate, freedom of speech, etc. In a practical sense, a lot of research effort and policy development is fragmented. And a former professor at this university, Steve Dove, has summed up these problems as the Commonwealth has the money, the states have the legal powers, and the local governments have the problems. And I think when we look at flooding, it's very much the case. The Commonwealth money, as Tony was saying, is often deployed after the event. And I mentioned the Grafton levy. Back in the old days, I can't tell you how far back, but Australia used to have a program where local governments, if they wanted to build flood defences, if they put up a third of the money, the state put up a third of the money, and the Commonwealth put a third of the money up. That program no longer exists, but it seems to me that that's a very practical way in which dispersed problems can be dealt with within the Federation. It's a question that there'll never be a definitive answer to, but it's a very good one. Now, Ros?
This year, spent over $14 billion on recovery from disasters, and a steady fraction of that on preparing for disasters. That's at the federal level. But the responsibility, as Jason said, for the problem is at the local government level. And the best we can do at that level is try and inform local government of the best science. And I have to say that the local governments, the councils we've been working with, have been extremely receptive of that best science that we can offer. And at the federal and state level, the local governments are very, very reliant on funding. And so the funding programs need to align with what the local governments want to do. And they try their best, but I think there could be a lot more alignment happening. It's a very messy bureaucracy. Also, you know, at ICEDS, we do put up submissions to various inquiries, Senate inquiries, and I recently presented to a Senate inquiry on solutions to natural disasters. So there are those opportunities as well. It just doesn't all happen very quickly. So, yeah.
I was going to mention my talk and I neglected it. Apparently, the National Climate Risk Assessment reports are going to be released later this month. There's 19 reports. It's been several years in the making. And I think in addition to the risk assessment reports will be the first national adaptation plan. So that's part of this, you know, gradual process. And a lot of universities and Bureau of Meteorology and CSIRO were involved in the development of those risk reports. There is a Senate inquiry as to why they've been delayed. We'll leave that. They're coming. Now, there's a question right up the back, and maybe one from Evelina. Have you got another one? Yep. Yeah, do Evelina first, and then one up the back. Thank you.
So another question relates to how we consider what natural is. And there was a comment in the chat about natural disasters being climate change induced. How we consider the definition of what is natural, and I suppose that relates further to nature-based solutions. Just to add on, there are some specific questions also about riverine flooding being beneficial given the pollution it carries with it. So again, that aspect maybe of the environmental system consequences of some of those nature-based solutions.
So I'll answer both of those questions, and then anyone else that wants to can as well. There is a huge push across the whole disaster risk reduction fraternity across the world to say there's no such thing as a natural disaster. I kind of agree in some respects. So the argument is it's only a disaster to people if we actually don't prepare for it properly. So as Jason was talking about before, if we hadn't rebuilt the houses in Darwin to a higher building standard, the next time a cyclone came along, we would have a natural disaster, or a so-called natural disaster. But because we built them to a higher standard, not necessarily the case. I don't necessarily agree if we think about the 2019-20 bushfires. Yes, if we just think about the people, you know, we were reasonably prepared. Not too many people were killed. But if we think about the forests and the wildlife that were really significantly harmed in those events, I think that was a natural disaster. And if we think about The fact that we doubled our greenhouse gas emissions for the whole of Australia that year, that was also a natural disaster. So I tend to not necessarily agree that there's no such thing as a natural disaster. Having said that, climate change is making these things worse, and climate change is human induced. So it's a very tricky discussion. Then coming to nature-based solutions, just as tricky. So what is a nature-based solution? Some people would argue that it would need to be something that you bring everything back to exactly how it was before people were there. And of course, we all know that that's impossible because people are there. And so our nature-based solutions need to be practical, but nature-inspired. And sometimes you can bring it back almost to how it was before people were there. But sometimes you want to adopt a nature-inspired approach to actually use the principles of nature to address flooding and the other issues that you're trying to address. And what was the second question?
That's enough.
Okay.
We've got all panel members want to respond to this one. I was about to say, I think we could run a whole conference for a few days about what is nature, what is unnatural, are disasters socio-nature, unnatural disasters, etc. So it's a great topic, but we won't get too diverted into it. We'll have a quick response from our other two panelists, and then we're going to have one more question, I think.
There's another question.
Fast and furious response. Donna Haraway and plenty of other people have talked about nature culture. A couple of nights ago, ANU actually hosted something about this as well, and I think that socio-natural element also comes in. Yes, there's also, I'm a social scientist, so I think about qualitative a lot over quantitative, but the pollution element is very much a quality element as well. Yeah. And so there's these questions, as Tony raised, so much effort goes into responding, reacting, post-disaster. What about that kind of generative, consistent work to care for environments, including the quality of water and the quantity as well?
I just make the point that natural disaster is not a very helpful term. It's actually human disaster in response to natural events. And natural disaster absolves us of responsibility. So it's probably a term that I'd like to see the end of. And policymakers should take responsibility for the things that happen to humans because we can't deal with nature.
Okay, I think one last question at the back, then we're going to break for morning tea and have plenty of time for discussion over morning tea.
Thanks. My question is interrelated, so you can continue on. It was around the use of language with communities, both with like regional and rural communities, and then also with First Nations. Is how did you find using the term climate change and climate induced and all those sorts of things, and did you get backlash, I guess, for rural communities and then also First Nations? I know they don't necessarily think of climate change as a concept, it's more around caring for the country. And did using the terms preparedness and resilience work any better for those communities?
Well, it's a big topic too. I'll just say, in my work in the Kimberleys, they definitely, the Indigenous people definitely refer to climate change. They say they can see it, they can see the effects of it, and they're very concerned about it. So there was no, denial of it. But maybe, Ros, would you like to talk about?
Oh, just very quickly. There's a huge amount of support in the communities that we worked with for, a lot of understanding of climate change and a lot of wanting to understand how nature-based solutions can address the increased flooding they're seeing in their areas. Having said that, there's always controversy. People that don't believe in climate change, people that only believe in engineering grey solutions. But there was a lot of support. There's no such thing as a one-fits-all community view. That's something for sure.
And the first part of your question, terms like rural, regional, or the Australian community, I think Kirsty made the point there are multiple publics, and that's probably a better way to look at it. Kirsty, do you want to have the final word?
Just on the climate change thing, I think it is talked about, but from what people have talked about and also what people sort of write about, there's often Indigenous ways might be considering country as sick or healthy. And again, Jagun Alliance is they've got work around heal the rivers. So these ideas of like healing and health and sickness, perhaps, while recognising, again, climate change is not equally inflicted, it's not equally felt, and there are colonial and other legacies around that as well. But I think those relationships between people and place through health, sickness, nourishing, and practices that they can and can't do because of the environment is how they would probably articulate it more so in my experience so far.
Okay, so we have the opportunity to form a community of people who have an interest in discussing this over a cup of tea or coffee. So it's out the door this way and just up the stairs.